Well, we're in the last section of this course, right? So we knowledge, reality, and self. So we go from epistemology to, some metaphysics aspects, and this is all interrelated. It's not like a totally separate thing. But now we'll kind of start looking at who we are as individuals and how we understand our own self. So we'll be in essence, cycling back through some of the thinkers have already thought, and then some other ones that, will probably be a little new to you. So we'll see how it goes. We're back in the soliloquies here, of course. All right. So what was Augustine's understanding of this knowledge and happiness? He kind of made a real simple statement about that. Anybody got that? What did he say? Nothing makes you unhappy as long as you're seeking knowledge, right? I mean, nobody's unhappy with knowledge. This isn't about maybe we would learn something, information. Well, we learned that, now we're not happy. That's not quite what he's after here. In other words, we're all in this pursuit of truth. It's an old cliched phrase to say, that we're out trying to find ourselves. But that really is what most of us spend our lives trying to do, isn't it? I mean, who are we? Why are we here? What's our place in the world? What's our relationship to the world? What's our relationship to other people? How do we understand who we are as individuals? These are the most basic questions out there, and they're things that are perpetual for us. They're not something that, go away. Now, part of what we're going to be talking about here this morning is you can silence these voices if you want, right? But we're seekers of truth for the most part, and these are some of the most eternal truths that we're going to be able to try to find answers to. Not that we could find them per se, but we can at least be on a journey towards them, right? So at some point we could almost understand this as an epistemic desire to know the self, but for Augustine, the self and the soul are really the same thing. So you're going to see how he's going to work out that if in other words, what were the two things again that Augustine in the Soliloquies was really wanting to know? Does anybody remember? He wanted to know
God himself.
God and himself. And he doesn't really think that he could do one or the other separately from each other. In other words, if I want to know God, I'm going to know something about myself. And as I know something about myself, I think I'm going to know something about God. So this whole thing is starting out in that type of motion for him. Which is probably why he sent, we're going to think back to why he centered himself with, at least in our text, 8 or 9 pages of prayer at the beginning of the whole Soliloquies. It's almost like he's trying to calm his spirit. He wants to know these two things. So he says nobody's going to be really unhappy with knowledge of themselves. That's always something that you're going to be happy with. And we do this all through our lives. We discover something about ourselves that it's new to us. I mean, anybody can think of anything in your own lives that it's not, it could be something that you like that you didn't realize, but that's almost a little superficial. Is there anything that ever surprised you, or even about other people, that they found out about their own personalities? Something about themselves they didn't quite grasp before, and it almost took them by surprise. Could be music, inclination, right? Could be that you just never knew you had a penchant for that. There was some opportunity there. Could be, for literature or the arts. I know for me, there was always an attraction to literature, but I think college opened that up in ways that I think I already shared you with my Eureka, my woke experience. Sorry, now that I'm cool, I can say that. When I took that music appreciation course, the first time, they dropped the needle down on some, concerto or something, and we started talking about it, I was kind of bland to it. I had this implicit understanding that these were good things that I should appreciate, but I had no appreciation for them. But I never realized how deep they were. I think you can do that with poetry too, right? I mean, you can pull poetry apart and not realize how deep something is. So a lot of times, these things that we expose ourselves to, they wind up revealing something about ourselves that we're not entirely sure that they existed before. And that's sort of where Augustine's going with this. Now, I've pulled that, some of this stuff from other writings because, even though we're talking about the Soliloquies here, there's a lot else, that he wrote that puts the whole thing, and I guess you can call it into like a better context per se, right? Like for instance, this is from his book, The Confessions. You know, he says, I turned to myself and I said, and you, who are you? You know, I mean, at some point, this is what we would call an existential moment. You know, what exactly am I? Okay, so in psychology, I was listening to NPR on the way over here, and they were talking about the art movement and how World War I affected culture. Most of us don't know a lot about World War I. First of all, it was a long time ago. But there were certain things about World War I that were revealing to a culture. One, that we were a world. That might sound a little funny, you know, but people really saw themselves as independent countries and didn't recognize the interconnectivity of everything. But when the whole world goes to war, it was violent. I mean, I don't know how many, 40 million people? I mean, there's a lot of death that came out of World War I. So what happened else, though, was the war really was a boon to the economy. They always are, right? Because there's a lot of manufacturing that goes into it. But as World War I ended, what do? We don't have the economy to make the things that everybody simply needs. So this is where you saw Edward Bernays. Anybody know who Edward Bernays is? He was a nephew, I think, of Sigmund Freud. He's the father of, I guess you might want to call it public relations or such. So he took Freudian techniques and said, well, here's what we can do. Why don't we, you know, create desires in people? You know, in other words, tap into their dreams, literally. And then what we'll do is we'll match products to those desires. And if there's a particular, you know, obstacle to that desire, well, then let's remove it. So I think I shared this with you at least. Remember me talking about instant cake mix? Okay, well, that came out of this, okay? So in other words, we need to find something to sell to people, but what's the obstacle? Well, we're not, you know, being good wives. Well, how far can we, you know, dwindle this down? Well, if they crack an egg, that seemed to be enough, that kind of thing. Sounds silly to us, but these were focus groups that they just constantly went through. And don't think this doesn't still happen now. I mean, you know, the markets will create a desire within us, you know, discover what the obstacle to that desire is to focus groups, and then they'll work hard to use some sort of advertising to remove that obstacle so that they can sell us something, right? Okay, my point isn't to trash culture. My point is that nobody would do that if there wasn't a natural, built-in desire for something within us, okay? I mean, it wasn't, they were trying to match something artificially to desires that we had, but it wasn't like they had to actually create the need for a desire. They had to match the desire to something else, okay? So we're always searching for these types of things, and Augustine knows this. So again, you know, just to refresh your memory, Augustine comes from like let's say an illicit youth, right? I mean, he was into women, he was into partying, and all and such, and his mother had converted to then Catholicism, Christianity prior to him, and prayed for him. And you know, when he finally, I guess you want to say, gave in, you know, he became a zealot almost. It's like now, you know, in other words, I'm actually searching for, how do you put it, my heart is, you know, I'm forgetting the phrase now, it's such famous.
Restless.
My heart is restless until it finds rest in you, O Lord, right? So it's the whole idea that the human person, from Augustine's point of view, has a restless heart. There's something there that needs to be solved. And by solved, I mean something to be fulfilled. Okay, so the way he talks about this is with the parable of the prodigal son or the two brothers. Sometimes it's called the pericope. That's just a segment in Scripture, the pericope of the two brothers. I know it's pretty famous, so what's the story? How does the story go? I'll fill in the gaps. Don't worry about getting it perfect. How does the story go?
Is it like there's two sons and that they're like each promised an inheritance, but one wants his now, so like then he takes it and you waste all the money, but the other one's still working for it.
Yeah.
And then once the other one loses all the money, he comes back and the other brother's mad that this father welcomes back.
Okay. That's good. Now let's build off that. It was something that was rightfully his. I mean, so it wasn't like he's stealing something, right? For both of the brothers. Now, it was a little odd that he wants it up front, but he wants to go. It doesn't really flat out say this, but Augustine would add implicitly, the young man wants to find himself, okay? So give me my money now. Now, he didn't just waste it. What did he spend it on? Anybody know? Women, partying, you name it, food, give it to his friends, okay? So you can almost see, you know, the universality of this. So this is why people who have no foundation in Christianity, this is, because besides the fact this is a very culturally iconic type parable, nonetheless, it's a universally relatable type situation. So you have somebody, you can see Augustine already is going to be attracted to this, right? I mean, this person was trying to satisfy a particular need. It's the same way, like, we do this every time when we're hungry and we don't want to wait for dinner, we just grab whatever's on the counter. I have no willpower. If there's something on the counter, I grab it. If it's not there, I don't think about it, right? That type of thing. Okay, so what's going on? Like, what this guy, he spends everything and he's poor. Does anybody remember, like, the story? Like, what is he eating and such?
He asks for a job and he goes, like, to feed pigs and stuff. He starts eating their food.
Yeah.
Their food.
Then he starts to think, man, if I were home, you know, I could eat this kind of, I mean, my father would certainly give me the food that he gives to the pigs and the cattle and such, you know. Okay, so at this point, though, you can imagine there's a lot of apprehension. So if somebody wanted to be really creative, you could almost start pulling this into, I've been unchained from the cave, you know, and now I'm starting to look around, but I'm apprehensive. And what do? I mean, you could imagine, could you imagine if you, like, bombed out of school, what it'd be like trying to go home and face your parents, you know? It's humiliating. So he was humiliated through that too. Now, does anybody know, like, where did the father and the son meet up?
Like outside the house, and there's like a trail that gets to the house, and they meet up there.
He went out for him, right? So, now, okay, you got to put this into Augustine's frame of mind that this God, you know, who really is the only thing that could rest the heart, is forever stable, right? So in other words, you know, God, we're going to be looking here, what we're getting at here is we're going to see what are the distractions for us to find this selfhood. And the reality is for Augustine, God, this, you know, the self-same, he calls him in other writings, the self-same is eternal and always stable, and he's always internal to the human person, right? But do you notice how this man the young brother went outside to try to find himself? I mean, who doesn't do that, right? I mean, think of all the various things that you and I will do to try to satisfy. And even if you don't have a Christian spirituality, that's not the point. You know, we still try to find some satisfaction for ourselves, and we typically do it on the outside. Well, you can see Augustine right off the bat is going to say, this is a futile thing. I mean, you're not going to be able to do this on the outside. There's only something. So, you know, then, of course, the other story that's not as pertinent to what we're talking about today is, you already said, the other brother who, could you imagine? Hey, I've been here, I've been stable, I've been loving, I've listened to you, and what the hell? You know, now this guy's coming back after he spent everything, you know? And then, of course, the famous line, you know, he was lost and now he's found. So this is why, you know, the prodigal son, such a strong, iconic story, right? But Augustine's trying to make the point that when we're trying to discover our selfhood, if we don't go interior to find it, if we go exterior, all we're going to do is be distracted. That's all that's ever going to happen, right? So all of the things in our world that are meant to basically fulfill our wants, we call them needs sometimes, right? So like I think I share with you, my wife, when my kids were young, psychologically, she made them, when they said, I need something, she almost would not even talk to them until they turned around and said, I want. It's okay to want. It's okay to want a slushie. It's okay to want this. You don't need those things. So let's start saying what you want, and then we can talk about whether or not it's proper that you get it. But we don't make those things, sometimes those distinctions psychologically with us. Think of the things that you and I, you know, would desire in the future, and we pose them as needs. You know, our needs are typically pretty basic, right? So nonetheless, he says, look, define yourself, it's only a distraction when you go outside. So remember, the whole soliloquy is really an interior dialectic. This is why he never needs to go outside of himself. Remember, he wants to find himself, and he wants to find his God. And he's convinced that if he finds one, he'll find the other, but he never has to travel outside of himself to do that. So he's staying just within these two, and he's convinced that anything on that side is inheritance. Now, he takes it a little far, even from a Christian standpoint, and it's because of his Manichaean background in the body. So he has a view of sexuality that's almost like that too. Even its proper use is a distraction. But we have to watch. There's a lot going on these days about us taking modern day ethos and morality and imposing it on something that's ancient. It's not quite fair. People will do that to us in 1,000 years, and we'd rather be judged in our own systems. So we have to go back and look at Augustine and say, okay, maybe he went a little bit too hard, against the body for sexuality, but once we understand what was going on in his life and the situation, we understand it. It was contextual, and it makes sense to us, even if we've moved on beyond it, okay? Now, interestingly enough, in Scripture, like in Luke, where the prodigal son appears, there's a line, this is where the young brother who was gone, when he came to that point of realization. It literally says, but when he came to himself. So it's that same language that Augustine's trying to use. But you notice, even though this is like Christian contextually, Augustine's not making dogmatic proclamations. You notice he's not saying, since it's there in Scripture, therefore you must believe. Since this is what the church said, therefore you must follow. He's not being dogmatic with this. He's using those references to explain something in a very philosophical way on how we discover who we are as ourselves, right? So you can go right back. I turned to myself and said, and you, who are you? He realizes that you're not going to find it on the outside, all right? So this has to have some import for us because, again, that's what we spend most of our lives, unfortunately, doing, trying to fulfill needs and things that, well, think of Christmas again. I think I shared with you, my wife at the nursing home, these people are in their 90s, and when you ask them, what did you get when you were 15, they told her it was one thing. They could say what they got. You guys aren't that much older. Can you say what you got when you were 14? I mean, we all did this, right? You want stuff for Christmas, and you think you're going to die if you don't get it. And then by January 6th, one one's broken, the other one's off. You never know what's going on. And this is interesting as an aside. Forget about, this per se. That's crass commercialism. We'd all agree with that. But you guys are going to have the chance to raise your children. What do you think you'll do differently? And it's okay if you just hope you're going to do this, right? I mean, what are you going to do? Just give them pens and paper and books so they can learn and write? You're going to be that kind of parent? What are you going to do? Have you thought about this? No? You're going to hope there's a really good app? And you can give them the phone, right? It's mesmerizing, right? My grandkids, it's not like they're hooked, but they are hooked, right? You put an app in front of them. Or how many cars now? Do any of your cars have the screens in the back? No, mine don't. We never know. I mean, I look at that stuff and I always buy 15-year-old cars. I'm thinking, oh great, there's another thing that won't work by the time I buy the car used, right? Every time I buy a car and it has a screen on the front, none of it works. It's like all I see is a bunch of jaggedy stuff. These are things in other words, we pass the cell phone to the next generation, and everybody tries to find ways to do that, and it gets very difficult. You always have these inspirations like I did. I was going to keep a log when my first daughter was born. From the day she was born, I was going to try to enter it every week as we went on, and that lasted about a month. Had good intentions, and by the time the second kid, even with me, there's 4 kids in my family, I'm the Bambino, so my mother, when we all got older, she gave us all of the picture books, the scrapbooks of all our photos, so the old ones that had the cellophane, you put the photo in and put the cellophane over. Well, my sister, who was, 16 years older than me, hers looked like it was done by some designer or something, and the thing was full. My second sister, you know, it was still there, but it wasn't the quite, you know, they weren't as the momentous, you know, pictures. Well, let me just tell you, by the time I got to me, there was one page and all the rest were in an envelope. You know, I mean, that's what happens, right? So you have like these grand visions how we're going to change things, but the world takes us by surprise. Now that's okay, but that's what he's calling the distractions. You know, we have a hard time really trying to control these things. So anyway. Okay. Now, Augustine's pretty much going to understand that the human person is the soul and the body, and you can't envision these two things separately. All right? So he doesn't have that same Platonic dualism where the soul's kind of like living inside and the body is something that... Augustine may understand the body as being something that, you know, is a sensory input that can distract us, but he's not going to say that the soul is separate somehow from that. Let's see. So, you know, he brings up in the Soliloquies in that one line, but it doesn't really talk about it. At least I don't recall. He's still wondering, you know, how does the immaterial soul move the material body? And as far as I could tell, he just kind of like left that and moved on. But nonetheless, let's see. Okay, so you could also call these powers faculties. You know, in other words, what's the capability or the faculty of the soul? So he'll talk about, you know, this memory, he'll talk about intelligence, he'll talk about the will, all these three things. Now, interestingly enough, he's also, you know, as being a Christian and being understood that he's made imago Dei in the image of God, he's going to see these things as transcendent things that also exist with God. So remember, he's after both understanding God and himself, and he's thinking the more I can know myself, perhaps the more I can know God, and the more that I can know God, the more it reveals myself. So he's starting to understand that these faculties that he has, and somehow these are, you know, powers that a deity has and shares with him. So there's a certain responsibility there, yet he understands, you know, that these things are not exactly clear for him per se. Like for instance, though, he'll make sure that these things are not separate objects within the human person. The body's not separate from the soul. The soul doesn't have separate parts like intelligence, will. And all of these things are going to make up the self. So again, he's just trying to get to the bottom and trying to figure out exactly who is this person that I'm calling the I. Anybody have anything? I hate that I talk here all the time, because it's hot. I think I'm going to fall over here. Okay. What was his point about the tree and the wall? Anybody pick up on that? We're going to talk about it in the next section here, in the last section. But he's starting, okay, he's going to start little by little moving into his understanding of the theory of consciousness. And he starts talking about this tree, and he starts talking about this wall, and falsity and truth. And he's now going to start trying to lay out how perhaps I may not understand these right, but is the truth of the falsity, do they exist in the actual thing, or do they only exist in the way that I'm sensed? You know, so because in other words, he says somebody might see that tree and can think it a wall. Somebody might see the wall and think it's some sort of line of trees, but that's got to be an error on my end. He doesn't see the error out there as much, but he's also going to wonder exactly how do I understand the distinctions between these two things. So what he's coming up with is that really it has to be something in the self that's deceived. You know, obviously these things are not changing to deceive the human person. There's something within the human person that by understanding what these things are outside is being deceived. So he's saying the truth or the falsity is really in the sensing of the thing. So he's starting to get the idea, you know, of the limits of this particular soul and the limits of the self. So you can see a lot of the thinkers that we've studied here today are really struggling with how we know the outside world via our senses. And the more and more that we're convinced of something, the more and more we probably see something that's not exactly what I always thought it was. Optical illusions are the easiest thing. But there's a lot of other things that just seem like that's what reality is, and then, you know, it could be one of our moments where we understand ourselves better, but we understand the reality a little different. Did anybody grow up thinking like that most adults just simply were sensible. Did you have that impression when you were younger? Like you can just trust adults? Did you? I mean, I did. But it was naive. I literally thought, because it's like everybody has their own world, right? So, I think there were 15 bars within 4 blocks of my house growing up. So there was the Catholic Word Vets right across the street from our house, and Sunday morning I used to see a lot of guys going there. My mom called it Sunday school. They drop the wives off at church and then they go off to the bar. But the guys would work in the plants. They'd get up, their wives would make them breakfast, they'd go to work in the plant, they'd come back, they'd have dinner, they'd go off to some sort of meeting, or they'd go to a bar and hang out for a while, and then they'd come back and call it a night and sit down and watch a TV show and go to bed. It seemed like a pretty easy life. And to me, that's what life must be. In fact, me and my wife were talking about this yesterday, and this is kind of interesting. What do you guys like? What's your impression of like the 1950s? Let me ask you that. What's your impression of what was life like in the 1950s in the United States? What do you think? Simple. Okay. What else? Structured. It was.
I think that kind of depends on like how your family lived it.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I told my wife too.
Like, for me, like my great grandmother, she's still alive, lived in the 1950s. She was a migrant worker.
Yeah.
So she would travel around the United States and work and face like discrimination and all that. So that's
well, that's exactly what I told my wife. So point taken. Point taken. The reason why we brought this up is because my wife works at this nursing home, and she asked them if you could pick any decade in the 20th century that you can live perpetually. They said the 1950s, and the first words in my mouth was, well, it really depends on, how your life was like in the 1950s. Okay, but my wife said, don't argue their point, and my wife had a point. Generally speaking, for the average person in the United States, overall, it wasn't half bad. It was post-war, right? So the people that came back were heroes. Nonetheless, they were just heroes. Some of them went off on GI Bills. There was a lot of plants that were looking for work now. A lot of the things, like in my town, it was the largest tank producing plant in the United States. It switched over to rail cars as soon as that was over, and trains were big, right? I mean, there were all kinds of train tracks in my neighborhood. In fact, I remember we used to make necklaces out of the coins. We would go on the railroad tracks and lay out our different coins and let the train run them over, and we'd go back and collect them. And they got to the point where they didn't even try to shoo us away anymore. They just dealt with us. They would literally stop the train. They'd make us all go line our coins, and they'd go stand over there and don't move. And then they'd run it over, go get them, that kind of thing, right? So now, so there was like all of this thing that was going on, but it was artificial. I mean, it was really a reaction to what came before it, and the 60s and all the the internal revolutions within our society were all evidences that that can't sustain itself, right? So all these things were, I guess, how do you want to say? What in God's name was I even talking about before I started this? I lost my train of thought. I know there was a reason to that. Right now, I have no idea exactly what it is. No, it's gone. All right. Okay. Well, maybe just as a side note on all of this, these are how cultural things can get into our heads, and how it's hard for us to relate even intergenerationally sometimes, because we don't share particular backgrounds. Maybe we can even talk about an epistemology of that, right? There's a totally different understanding of it. To me, it was like so artificial that it seemed fake. Now, I'm probably the youngest of the baby boomers, and my sisters were like I don't know. One was a hippie sort of, so flower power was the thing. So they painted flowers. Anything that you could paint in our house had flowers painted on it. My sister thought that was cool. Even then I had longer hair, so she'd put in like these leather peace sign barrettes in my hair and thought this, I'll make my little brother look like this. So, you see, everything is like a reaction, which makes us, gives us pause, like, a lot of the stuff, like my wife always talks about this swinging pendulum, right? A lot of things in culture and society, since they're all reactionary, are reacting to something that came before it. And we have a lot of stuff that's going on right now that is that too. And it's not going to be the same world when you guys are my age. You're going to be, there's going to be a different reaction. It's coming back. And anyway, so I think that somehow these things, with Augustine's point of view, would do two things. One, a lot of this stuff becomes a distraction for us if we can't sort through it properly. But the other thing also, I could even see like how he would maybe talk about in the trees and the walls, that the falsity is a lot of times in our perceptions of these things. So how does this then develop who we are as ourselves? And it's always the self, it's always us in our own consciousness that's going to be deceived. It's not the thing that's out there, which really makes you think about like how when we start looking at the world, because we're always going to compare ourselves to the world. I think it's one of his problems too, is that, if you're going to look externally, maybe not just for the distractions that are out there, but are you looking for the standards outside there? So if you look for the standards outside there, that's going to give you a different understanding of who you are too. Now we have to have some standard, but he's basically set it out. The standard for him is God, and basically how he can understand that. But there's got to be something to the effect of how, the farther that we can get removed from how the culture is affecting us, the clearer picture. It's like we need some sort of bird's eye view on this, right? I think you're right on that, I think. No? You need some sort of view on this. So it gets a little difficult anyway. But he talks about then this consciousness, these souls, these sense and the trees and everything is, and he says, look, it is the body that senses, though it's the soul, the intelligence and stuff that's going to, format all of this. But he's got a little bit different argument for the existence of things than Descartes did later. So we're here with Augustine, he's starting to think that the outside world, of course exists. It's because he's conscious of it. So he realizes that, he can be in error. It could be my perception and does not sees the tree as the wall, or the wall as the tree, but nonetheless, they're there because I'm conscious of it. So then how would you work that out then to know that the outside world is not being deceived? I'm not quite sure that he was overly concerned with that in the soliloquies, at least nothing that I can pick up from that I saw that. So he starts this really four-part argument. And he says, first of all, and I know this is obvious, but if you haven't picked up yet in philosophy, they always start with what is just should be dead obvious and then build off of it, because now you have a really good foundation. So he's going to say, we're going to call something true if it is as it is. And we're going to call it false if it is as it is not. All right? Then he says, we're also going to have to realize, and maybe that wasn't the best way to put it, the object there. The objects, they are going to be true. They are as they are, or they are as they are not, only to the senses. Okay, it has nothing to do. Oh, I know where I was going to go with this earlier. Let me back up a little bit. There's been a lot in the news in the last year and a half so, and don't take this as I'm trying to vie with one political spectrum. It's just that it was something that I recognized as soon as it came out. We had that phrase in politics known as alternative facts. Has everybody heard about that? Yeah, okay. Now, without defending what the woman was talking about, because I don't want to do that. I think she was very inarticulate. I don't think it was, in other words, are facts self-interpreting? In other words, if we just simply got all the facts and put them on the table, would we know exactly what reality is? Would we know what truth is? Probably not, right? I mean, two lawyers representing two different sides in a court case are both presenting facts. If they were that self-interpreting, we wouldn't need the system that we necessarily have, right? So again, I'm not defending what she was talking about. In fact, I forget, thank you, but that's fine. But when I first heard that, I thought, that's a little odd, because when people think that facts are self-interpreting, like if I simply present you with the fact of something, then therefore you're going to acquiesce to it, that's almost like fundamentalist, isn't it? It's almost like, if you were in a certain line of Christianity, I'll just show you where it reads it in the Bible, and then we're done. See, there it is. but nobody ever really argues about the fact that it's there. It's always, how do we understand this fact and how do we relate to this? So, a lot of how, these errors and such, again, it's the intellect, it's the memory, it's the intelligence, it's all these things that are working together, and we know that they are fallible. We know that our memory can, suffer. We know that our intelligence is not perfect. We also know, that the will isn't always there. We will gladly acquiesce to things that conform to our previous thought very quickly, because it conforms to what we believe, and I guess that's part of our political, climate right now. But nonetheless, so the object is only going to be true or false for the senses. It's not true or false in itself, so there probably is some unalterable fact out there. We're just going to have a hard time reaching it. And then he talks about how it's the soul that has consciousness, right? So it's like this sensing that the soul can do of this. And he knows the body is true because of that. Because remember, he doesn't disconnect the body from the soul. So if he can grasp that this body has, that there's a consciousness there that's a thinking thing, then this body goes along with it. Descartes could only get to the thinking, thing inside. That didn't, for Descartes, prove the body, that he was going from a different point. Augustine's not going to accept that premise. Augustine's going to say, hey, look, you can't separate the body and the soul. So if I'm a conscious thinking thing, then this body is here too, all right? So he builds these four things up a little bit, and then he tries to conclude from these, that the soul exists, or the body could not. In other words, if I'm here and I know my body has extension and I'm able to tap it and all these things, then there has to be a consciousness that goes with that body. So you could see that, he's not working with something entirely different that Descartes did, but in a little bit different way. Descartes may have said, well, I think, therefore I am, and he's like, well, I'm conscious so that other things exist. But this is what brings up an interesting point. And he brings it up in here. He doesn't work through it. But did anybody pick up what he said about rocks that might be in the bowels of the earth? Did anybody pick up what he said about that? In other words, let's imagine a rock that nobody's ever seen. Can it exist outside of our consciousness? And this is not quite the same as it's a tree fall in the woods. Does anybody hear it? That type of thing. But it's not dissimilar from that either, is it? In other words, he doesn't think that this is not solipsism. This isn't like the objects only exist because my mind projects them. That's not what he's trying to say. But he's trying to say that these things can only have existence in some sort of consciousness. And this consciousness is not shared with other types of beings, right? So, we might talk about animals who, are sensing beings, but they're not going to have the same consciousness as we have. They're not going to see a rock in the same way I have. Like, they would never see some sort of Lady Gaga brands herself, right? I mean, so, she sells herself as a brand. There's no animal would be able to pick up on that, right? They would recognize, perhaps this is a, bipedal female or whatever they might come up with, but they're never going to accept that this is some sort of brand or entertainer. So there's something there that's exclusive, to us, the way our faculties of the soul are. And of course, the vegetative souls will never pick up on this. So these things, in a certain degree for him, they exist because of the consciousness of the rational mind. Because without a rational mind, who would be conscious of these things? Okay. Now, if that sounds like a little sci-fi and everything for you, and a little weird, remember how he said, when you find who you are, you will also discover God. And if you discover God, that you will then find you. And that if you are made imago Dei, and you share in the memory, the intelligence, and the will, these two are attributes of God. So therefore, if nothing exists outside of our consciousness, but obviously we don't always think about the rocks that are buried in the bowels of the earth, but God does. So it's almost like all these things exist in his consciousness. So it's almost like he can, in some way, at least in Augustinian thought, and I might be pushing this because, by the way, there's always disagreement on what people think on these certain things. All creation exists in the mind of God. It's held in his consciousness. So what he's trying to get at, he's not using this as a proof for God, but he's trying to get at that these two things that we share, and if we're consciousness of the tree, now we are only going to see the falsity of the truth in something depending on how it reacts to our senses. God doesn't have that issue. So for God, there's always a one-to-one correlation between the veracity and the truth of what's out there and what's here. So it's almost like he suspends all things. Do you see how Descartes didn't do it this way, did he? Descartes just basically said, I'm sensing these things, and God would not allow me to be deceived, because that would be outside of the perfection of a God. And God must exist because a perfect being, existence is part of perfection, so God must exist. And God would not allow me to be deceived, because that would then not be a perfect God. So then I can be at least confident somewhat that those things exist out there. Augustine came at it from a different view. Augustine's like, well, basically these things are always part of a consciousness. And me and God have that same thing going on, even though his is in perfection and mine might not see the truth in something, but actually see the falsity of it, but he does not. So all things are suspended by God. It's a different understanding of God's relation to creation. So do you see how he moves into his understanding of consciousness from all of this? Of course, it's Christian, but that's his thing. I mean, he's not going to do this outside of his own framework, right? Nonetheless. So he says, therefore, then, I know that existence is there. That's there, I'm here, and it must be true. Because consciousness, you have to be conscious of something. And as long as I'm conscious of these things, then therefore they must exist. Which is kind of like where he was probably going with these things that you cannot see. How could they possibly exist outside of my consciousness? But all the things I do see do exist by my consciousness. Therefore, there's an existence out there. Now, this may or may not be some sort of grand theory for such, but you see, he's trying to get to who I am, and this is all being inner-reflected. You see, then now, like how we talked a little bit in the end here, why he thinks so much of the outside and the exterior is a distraction. He's like, the more that you get in, the more you, like today we'd say, the more you're worried about, binge watching TV shows and video games and trying to do this, those, look, they're taking you away from yourself, right? Which is interesting, because it's been an argument that, I thought, and I didn't think about it until I started going over this again the other week, was, there's a lot with like the phones and such, people always said, well, they're disconnecting us from each other. I never really thought that. In many ways, I think maybe they're bringing us closer, but I always thought they were disconnecting us from ourselves more. And I think because it became a more, how do you want to say, a more disguised form of distraction. We could literally, not think that we're being disconnected. Because, hey, we're talking to other people through this. We have social media. It's social, for God's sakes. But it's taking us away from ourselves. And maybe that's why Augustine would say, you got to start with the prayer. And he ends in this, too, by the way, with a prayer. What exactly was it that he said? And it's interesting. He says, hold thy light before me and call me back from my wandering. It's almost as if he's saying, come out and meet me. I've spent all my inheritance. I went through the distractions. I'm done. Call me back from my wandering. And again, this light of God. He's like, look, I need this light. So again, if you're even thinking about, Plato, what he needs the light. And it's all this same idea. So anyway, we'll finish the second part of this on the Soliloquies on Wednesday. But what do you think? Anything for the good of the cause? No? Need a drink after that?